Don't come home, your sister doesn't want you there. The champagne glass slipped in my hand, not from nerves, but because I recognized the voice behind me before I turned around. She actually invited them, my mother whispered to my sister, thinking the string quartet was loud enough to cover it. After everything. Can you believe her? I didn't turn. I just watched the condensation drip off the glass onto my wedding dress, one cold bead at a time, and I thought about the letter still folded in my clutch purse, the one dated 11 years ago, the one that started with the words "Don't come home." My mother's next words were quieter, meant only for my sister. Just smile tonight. We'll deal with her after the honeymoon. Deal with me. On my own wedding day. I smiled too, but I already knew something they didn't. My name is Rachel Ann Whitfield, and on the day of this wedding I was 34 years old. 11 years earlier my parents, Diane and Robert Whitfield, had told me not to come home for Thanksgiving because, in my mother's exact words over the phone, "Your sister doesn't want you there, and honestly, neither do we." I hadn't done anything except refuse to co-sign a $40,000 loan for my sister Melissa's failing boutique. That was it. That was the crime. I said no, and 3 days later I was erased from the family group chat, uninvited from Christmas, and informed I was too difficult to have around. So I left. I built a logistics consulting firm from a card table in a studio apartment in Columbus, Ohio. 11 years later, that firm had 61 employees and $8.2 million in annual revenue. I married Daniel Cho, a structural engineer I met at a conference in Denver, on a rooftop overlooking the Scioto River with 140 guests. My parents were not on the original guest list. Neither was Melissa. They came anyway. And what happened over the next 6 hours would end with my mother's real estate license suspended, my sister facing wire fraud charges, and my father standing in the rain outside my house 4 months later, begging to be let in. But to understand how we got there, you need to understand what I found when I finally looked. It started 3 weeks before the wedding, at what should have been an unremarkable engagement dinner. My mother had graciously offered to host it at her house, which should have been my first warning. My mother didn't do anything without an angle. She'd set the table with the good china, the same china she hadn't used since my sister's baby shower, and she'd put me at the far end, near the kitchen door, while Melissa sat directly across from Daniel. Melissa was wearing a dress I recognized. It was mine, a burgundy wrap dress I'd left at my parents' house in 2015 and never gotten back. She'd had it altered. She was drinking my father's good scotch, neat in a crystal tumbler, laughing too loud at something Daniel said, leaning forward every time she did it. "So Daniel," she said, swirling the ice, "did Rachel tell you she used to work at a gas station? Before the whole—" She waved her hand vaguely. "Business thing. I had worked at a gas station for 4 months, while I was building the firm at night. I told Daniel that story myself on our 3rd date, and he told me it was the most impressive thing he'd ever heard. She mentioned it," Daniel said evenly. "Said it funded her first server contract." Melissa's smile flickered, just slightly, like a bulb about to die. My mother jumped in smoothly, refilling wine glasses. "Rachel's always been so resourceful," she said, in the tone people use for words that aren't really compliments. I said nothing. I smiled, thanked her for hosting, and noticed, because I notice things now, it's basically my job, that my father hadn't looked at me once all night. 2 days after the dinner, my wedding planner, Priya, called me confused. Someone had contacted 3 of my vendors, the caterer, the florist, and the venue coordinator, asking to be added as a secondary point of contact on behalf of the bride's family. The name on the request was Diane Whitfield. I called the venue coordinator myself. "Oh," she said, "she was helping coordinate since you're so busy with work," the coordinator said. She asked about the seating chart mostly, and whether there was room to add 2 more names. 2 more names. My parents were adding guests to my wedding without asking me. I let it go. I told Priya to politely decline any changes and said nothing to my mother. I wanted to see what she'd do next. A week later I was going through old boxes in my closet, looking for a hairpin my grandmother had left me, When I found my phone's cloud backup still synced to an old number I hadn't used in years. A number my mother didn't know I could still access remotely through a forwarding service. There was a voicemail from my mother to my sister, accidentally sent to the wrong contact, dated the week after the engagement dinner. She's marrying an engineer, Mel. Structural engineer. Good family, they own property in Boulder. This is our way back in. You be nice to him. Rachel's not going to keep us out of this if he likes us. Just play along at the wedding, smile, and let me handle the rest. I sat on my closet floor and listened to it 4 times. I called my mother. I told her calmly that I knew she'd contacted my vendors. "Oh honey, I was just trying to help," she said instantly without missing a beat. "You're so overwhelmed with the business, I thought I'd handle the logistical redundancies. Vendor management is basically project coordination, and I used to do the PDA fundraisers, remember? I know how these things work." Logistical redundancies. From a woman who'd never run a spreadsheet in her life. "I appreciate that," I said. "But I've got it handled." "Of course," she said. "I just want everything to be perfect for you." I pretended to believe her. I even thanked her. That pretend belief bought me time, and time was exactly what I needed. I hired someone I trusted, my old college roommate, Angela, now a private investigator specializing in financial fraud, to quietly look into what my mother's real estate business had been doing for the past 2 years. Something about that voicemail, "This is our way back in," had a transactional coldness to it I couldn't shake. My mother wasn't sentimental. If she wanted back into my life, there was a $sign attached. Angela found it in 9 days. My mother had been using her real estate license to run a small-scale flipping scheme, buying distressed properties under an LLC called Whitfield Family Holdings, inflating appraisal values using a cooperative appraiser, and reselling to unsuspecting first-time buyers, mostly young couples, at 30 to 40% markups. Total estimated fraud across 11 properties, $610,000. And Melissa wasn't just aware of it. She was the LLC's registered co-manager. The failing boutique I'd refused to fund in 2015 had actually closed within 8 months, but Melissa had kept telling our parents it was still open, using it as a shell to launder cash from the flips. My $40,000 refusal, the thing that got me erased from my family, hadn't been about a boutique at all. It had been about funding a fraud operation, and I was the only one who'd said no. They hadn't cut me off because I was difficult. They cut me off because I couldn't be controlled. The final piece came almost by accident. I'd stopped by my parents' house to drop off a wedding favor sample, and I heard them through the screen door before they knew I'd arrived. "She's going to be worth what, 8 million? 9? My father was saying. "Once she's married into the Cho family too. She'll come around," my mother said. "She always does. Rachel likes being the bigger person. We just have to give her the chance to forgive us publicly. People like her, they need the redemption arc. We show up, we cry a little, we let her have her moment. Melissa, you apologize first, get it on video if you can, in case we need it later for the business stuff. In case we need it later for the business stuff." They weren't planning to reconcile with me. They were planning to use my wedding as a public alibi. I decided right there on the porch that I wasn't going to confront them yet. If I came in swinging with what I knew, they'd lawyer up, delete records, move the LLC's assets, and vanish into some other scheme in another state. I needed them relaxed, confident, sloppy. I needed them to think they'd already won. So I gave them exactly what my mother said they needed: the redemption arc. I called my mother the next day, and I let my voice wobble just slightly, like it used to when I was 23 and desperate for her approval. "I've been thinking," I said. "Maybe it's time we tried again. I don't want to walk down the aisle without my family there." I could hear her trying not to sound triumphant. "Oh, sweetheart. We'd love that." Over the next 2 weeks, I played a version of myself I hadn't been in over a decade, soft-spoken, grateful, a little lost. I let my mother help with seating charts again. I let Melissa borrow my wedding dress for alterations, advice she didn't need. I wore my hair the way my mother always said looked more approachable. I let my shoulders curve inward when I spoke to them, Let my sentences trail off unfinished, the way they used to when I was the family's designated pushover. Daniel noticed. "You're doing something," he said one night, watching me practice a smaller, meeker version of my own laugh in the bathroom mirror. "I'm giving them rope," I said. "Enough to feel safe. Enough to hang themselves." He didn't ask any more questions. He just started quietly saving every text message my mother and sister sent him. The bait was simple. A document. I told my mother, in what I made sure sounded like an unguarded moment, that Daniel and I were restructuring our finances before the wedding, combining accounts, and that as part of that, I was being asked by our attorney to disclose any family financial obligations or informal loans for a joint asset statement. I mentioned, almost carelessly, that I still had access to old shared account records from years ago, and that my accountant wanted a full picture before the wedding, just as a formality. It was a lie. There was no joint asset statement. But it was a lie specifically engineered to make my mother panic about what old records might resurface, and panicked people make phone calls. Angela helped me set up a legal single-party consent recording line, legal in Ohio, where I live, routed through a number I gave my mother as my new business line, easier for the wedding stuff. I told her to use it for anything urgent. She called it 4 times in the next 10 days. On the 3rd call, my phone buzzed against the kitchen counter while Daniel and I were eating dinner, and I watched the screen light up with her name, and I felt my pulse do something strange and steady like a countdown. I let it ring twice before I answered, playing calm but slightly nervous, exactly the character I'd been building for 3 weeks. On that call, my mother told me, trying to sound casual, that if anyone asked, the family loan for Melissa's boutique had been fully repaid in 2016. And that I should remember it that way if the subject ever came up with my accountant. She was pre-writing my testimony. She was building her alibi through me in real time on a recorded line for days before my wedding. I hung up and sat very still at the kitchen table. "That's it," I told Daniel. "That's the one we needed." The wedding reception was held under string lights on a rooftop terrace, 60 stories above a city my parents didn't know I'd fallen in love with. At a company they didn't understand, married to a man they thought was their ticket back into my life. Melissa, for glasses of champagne in, stood up during the toasts uninvited. She hadn't been on the program. She tapped her glass with a fork anyway, and the room out of politeness went quiet. "I just want to say," she said, swaying slightly, "that I'm so proud of my little sister for finally getting her act together. It wasn't always easy growing up with someone so intense. But look at her now. Married up, got the big house, the big business. Guess the gas station days paid off, huh?" A ripple of uncomfortable laughter. My mother beamed like this was charming. "And Mom and Dad," Melissa continued, raising her glass toward them. "Thank you for always believing Rachel would come around, even when she made it so hard. Family forgives. That's what we do." I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I never do. It's not where my power lives. "Thank you, Melissa," I said, and the room turned to me instead, the way rooms do when someone speaks quietly enough that people have to lean in. Since we're doing toasts about family, I actually have a few things I'd like to share too. Consider it my wedding gift to all of you. The truth finally out loud. I held up my phone. In 2015, I was told not to come home for Thanksgiving because, and I quote, "Your sister doesn't want you there, and honestly, neither do we." I was told this because I refused to fund $40,000 into Melissa's boutique. I want you all to know that boutique closed in under a year. It was never really a boutique. It was a shell company for a real estate fraud operation my mother has been running for the past 2 years under the name Whitfield Family Holdings. 11 properties, inflated appraisals, $610,000 taken from first-time homebuyers who trusted a licensed realtor. The silence had a texture to it now, thick and cold. "Rachel." My mother started standing. "I'm not finished," I said, still quiet. "For days ago, my mother called me and asked me to lie to my own accountant about a loan that was never repaid, to protect a story she's been building for years. I have that recording. It's legal." I checked. I pressed play. My mother's voice, tinny through the phone speaker, filled the rooftop. Just remember it that way if it comes up. Okay? For everyone's sake. My father tried to stand. This is a private family matter. This is not the place. You're right, I said. It's not. But you made it the place 3 weeks ago when I overheard you on your own porch calling my wedding a redemption arc. You were staging for the business stuff. You wanted a video of Melissa apologizing so you'd have something to show investigators later. So here's your video. Everyone's filming. Smile. Melissa's glass slipped from her hand and shattered on the terrace tile. The same sound I realized later, as the glass at the very start of that night. Except this time it wasn't my hand shaking. 2 men I didn't recognize moved through the crowd near the entrance. I'd sent Angela's file to the Ohio Division of Real Estate and separately to a detective handling a wire fraud complaint from one of the defrauded homebuyers, a young couple who'd reached out to a local news investigator months earlier and through Angela, eventually to me. They'd been waiting outside, time to arrive exactly when the toast ended, because I'd told them precisely when that would be. Diane Whitfield, one of them said. We need a few minutes of your time. I picked up the old burgundy wrap dress hem that Melissa had borrowed. She'd left the original alteration receipt in my mother's kitchen drawer. A small detail Angela had photographed weeks earlier as evidence that Melissa had lied about even owning it, and I set the printed copy of that receipt on the table in front of her, torn once, cleanly, down the middle. That was never yours, I said. None of it ever was. Then I sat back down next to my husband, picked up my glass and finished my champagne. Within 6 weeks, the consequences arrived with the flat, procedural rhythm of a news report. Diane Whitfield's real estate license was suspended pending investigation by the Ohio Division of Real Estate, with formal revocation proceedings filed in the following months. Civil suits from 4 of the 11 defrauded homebuyers followed within the year, seeking a combined $340,000 in damages. Melissa Whitfield was charged with conspiracy to commit wire fraud as a registered co-manager of Whitfield Family Holdings LLC. She accepted a plea agreement requiring restitution and probation rather than risk trial. Robert Whitfield was not criminally charged. He'd stayed just far enough from the paperwork, but he was named in 2 of the civil suits as a beneficiary of the fraud proceeds. And the country club that had been the center of his social life for 20 years quietly declined to renew his membership. The 2 young buyers whose complaint had started Angela's outside investigation received priority in the restitution order, in part because I paid for their legal representation myself, anonymously, through my firm's foundation. I never told them it was me. Some things you do because they're right, not because you need the credit. My firm's employees never knew the details, but they knew I took 2 days off after the wedding and came back different. Steadier, somehow, like something that had been held too tight for 11 years had finally let go. I gave everyone an extra paid day off that quarter. No announcement. No memo explaining why. 4 months later, on a Tuesday night with rain coming down hard enough to blur the porch light, my doorbell rang. It was my father. No umbrella, no car in the driveway. He'd had it repossessed 2 weeks earlier, I later learned. He looked smaller than I remembered, his coat soaked through. Standing on the same kind of threshold, he once told me I wasn't welcome to cross. Rachel, he said, voice cracking. Please. I have nowhere else to go. Your mother won't, Melissa's. I just need a place to stay. Few nights. That's all. I stood in the doorway, warm light behind me, and I thought about a Thanksgiving 11 years ago, and a phone call, and 5 words that had reshaped my entire life. Your sister doesn't want you there. I know exactly what it feels like to stand outside a door and be told there's no room for you. I said. I hope you remember this feeling. Take care of yourself, Dad. And I closed the door. Gently. No slam, no shout. Just a quiet, final click of the latch. Daniel was waiting in the kitchen with 2 mugs of tea already poured, like he'd known before I did. You okay? He asked. I am, I said, and meant it, sitting down across from the one person who'd never once made me perform smaller than I was. For the first time in 11 years, I actually am. Here's what I learned. The people who taught you that your worth was conditional will always resent you the moment you stop being controllable. Being the difficult one for saying no is often just the first sign you were the only one paying attention. And real family, the kind worth keeping, never needs you to shrink to prove you love them. If someone in your life has ever told you that you weren't wanted for simply telling the truth, I want to hear about it. Drop your story in the comments. I read every single one. If this story hit home, hit like, subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next one.